Welcome everyone to our Regen Circle. It is Saturday, July 30th, and we are doing an exploration of mythopoetics for integrating moments of significance. My name is Lauren. I'm the co-founder of Regen Collective, and joining me today is Chaise Levy, who is a mythopoetic storyteller and a rites of passage leader. And we're having a special Regen Circle today to explore an aspect of a project that we are prototyping. Our Regen Coaching Circle is designed to bring together community members and educators in a very special type of circle where we explore participatory learning experiences together in order to co-create the experiences as well as to pass them on and stimulate the social field towards social regeneration. One aspect of this coaching circle experience that we're designing is integrating moments of significance. In our team, we have explored the importance of rites of passage and the mentoring and the community witness experience that happens in a traditional rites of passage. In our modern era, the indigenous traditional style of rite of passage, it really isn't happening anymore. And part of the effects of that is that people are becoming less present, less aware, and less participatory. The modern world has become very flat in a way, let's say. It's become very one-dimensional. We need to be able to experience these multiple levels of reality, but we also need to be able to share them with others in order for them to become more integrated. Our foundational understanding is that every human being has the sensory ability. We all have that capacity to have threshold experiences. However, we need one another to integrate those experiences. We need the reflective experiences of a mentor, of a community circle, of a wise elder, to be able to integrate these threshold experiences and for them to become a moment of significance that then informs our presence and informs our ability to move forward into the future. So one of the ways that we could be doing this is by inviting in the mythopoetic experience of reality. So we wanted to bring you here today, Chaise, to explore this with you. Chaise, if you could begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and your experience and love of the mythopoetics and how you've been using this with rites of passage.
Great, thank you. I feel very welcomed, and thanks for this space setting of the vision. So my name's Chaise Levy. I grew up in Chumash and Tongva territory in Southern California, a place called Topanga Canyon, which means where the mountains meet the sea. It's a beautiful, deep place, and I currently am moving around. I'm in the middle of moving, but we've been living on Lishanaloni land in Oakland, California, and really grateful because the external wildness is such a key factor in my experience of my internal wildness, and I've been reflecting a lot on this idea of like, how did I get here? Why am I sitting here? And how did it happen? And just really feeling grateful for my grandmother, Elizabeth, who throughout my whole life paid for me to take music lessons and go to drama camp every summer. And that's how I really learned how to love stories, was by getting on the stage and telling them with people. And I didn't realize the profound effect it was having on me until much later in my life. And um, just remembering in this moment, I was in The Tempest, which was one of the last plays that Shakespeare wrote, and I played this, kind of minor character, and I was super upset about it because I had, grand notions of myself. And about 15 years later, I came to find that I'm actually descended from the person who wrote the letter that play is based on. So this ship was shipwrecked in Bermuda coming from England, and William Strachey wrote a letter back to the Queen of England. Somehow Shakespeare got his hands on it and it became The Tempest. And so I just feel the ways in which I'm both in this life have been tuteled in story, but there's also something else going on, right? And that's the mythopoetic lens in some way, being able to see these patterns, these archetypal packages that are just kind of getting passed along. And for me, my journey with being a teller of stories, because I think as humans, they're not the first person to say it, and I'm probably not the last person to say it, but as humans, we just have stories. We're always in a story. We're meaning-making beings, and so we're all carrying them. But my first kind of jump into telling stories in this way that I do really came through the sitting in a church in West Marin and listening to Dr. Martin Shaw tell a story for the first time. And I had been trying to make it as a recording artist and touring with this band and doing all of this stuff. And I just watched Dr. Martin Shaw standing on that stage telling a story. And I was like, that is what I've been trying to do with this guitar thing for 10 years. And I just didn't even know that was possible. So I just am deeply in deep debt and gratitude to his work and his just being in the world, opening this small crack into a different world for me. It's hard to say how the mythopoetic informs my work in rites of passage, because it's like the water that I'm swim. When I come into a team that's getting ready to support either an individual or a group of young people in a rites of passage experience, that's what I'm walking in with, is this sense of the mythopoetic both being about storytelling and being able to tell stories, but also it's a way of hearing stories that it's my job to do in a rites of passage experience. I'm sitting there as the person who can hear the myth that the young person is saying, even though they've never heard the myth that they're telling. And then being able to, without doing too much like force, be like, oh, this is what I heard. This little tidbit from this story, or this little poem, or this, connection. Maybe you should pay more attention to butterflies, or just thinking about experiences I've had with young people out in the wilderness, and that and sometimes it does look like actually sitting down and telling stories, and then inviting the young people to tangle with them and see what happens when we all focus on one image from a story, because often the whole story is too big and we're all got an image and then something gets strung together.
Beautiful. Thank you for that introduction. In our work in Regen Collective, we're nested inside of the Presencing Institute. And part of Theory U is as a deep dive experience and this U journey. The first half of it, we might say, is all about letting go. And then the second half is letting come, and this emergent process. And so I wanted to explore with you, in mythopoetic storytelling, there's also an aspect that's about letting go and then letting come. I wondered if you could speak to this aspect of letting go, taking inventory of what we're carrying with us, even before we start to tell a story, but also as a part of myth telling or hearing a myth. There's an aspect of purification that happens in the process of telling a myth or in hearing a myth. And I would love to hear you speak to that.
Awesome, thanks. Dive right into the deep interior place. So much of my current pedagogical practice, both around storytelling, but also around my activist practice and my practice with change and transformation, has been about coming to this sense that being human and having a body, and also living in a cultural sphere, is like living in a haunted territory. That there's like sites in my body, there's sites in my family lineage, and there's sites in my culture, in this culture that we're sharing, right? We're all got distinct cultures, and then there's this kind of monocrop culture that we're all dancing with, and that there's sites where there is energy that's stuck in my body, and maybe it's memories or just tension or stories, and so much of my kind of way that I've been thinking about storying this for myself is that those stuck places actually are inhabited by some sort of animate energy that can be engaged with, right? Maybe it's not a conversation, but can be engaged with. And that the actual move of acknowledging and seeing and taking inventory of the ghosts that are with me is the first move before letting go. Because if I try to let go in my life, if I try to let go of something that's unacknowledged, I'm just double exiling it, right? Like it's like this sense of like it's already unacknowledged. If I let it go, I'm just pushing it further away. And there's this image in Beowulf, which is, kind of put out there as like the sort of furthest back ancestor we can find of epic mythologic storytelling from the English speaking world. There's this image of, everyone is gathered in the mead hall in the longhouse at this feast together, and they're praising each other and boasting and drinking and eating, and it's this experience of connection. And at the door is Grendel, who's this monster, and Grendel doesn't just break down the door. Grendel knocks at the door and scratches at the door and kind of moans at the door, and no one lets the Grendel in. And it's in that no one letting the Grendel in that Grendel becomes a monster. Grendel's monstrous, right? But he becomes a monster when no one lets him in. Then he breaks down the door and wreaks havoc. That's a very violent poem, right? So, and so this sense of, okay, what if I listen to that image, and instead of letting go, I acknowledge, I take inventory first. And one of my teachers, Stephen Jenkinson, he talks about orphan wisdom, and orphan wisdom is like, what is the wisdom that we're carrying as people who, or is there a possibility of wisdom that we're carrying as people who have been removed from intact cultures by flows of power and colonization over thousands of years? And what if the first move is actually bereavement? Like we see that we lost something, and instead of trying to find something or let go of what we have instead, we actually just grieve the loss first. And so all of those things kind of come up with this kind of what I hear us describing and what you describe in Lauren, this like kind of triple move of acknowledgement and then letting go and then letting come. And I think that we could, in that place, kind of we could fall on the work of Joseph Campbell, in this description of the three moves in a story of, you know, um, you know, of these sort of like severance, threshold, and return kind of archetypes that we see in rites of passage, but we also see in Joseph Campbell's work about the mythic and his description of the hero's journey, um, which we can talk. I won't just riff on the hero's journey too much because it's not. I could go down the ways in which I think that's too small for us, and that's one way that we see that kind of theme in some stories, and they're the stories that we get told the most, I think.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love this this idea of acknowledgement, beginning with the acknowledgement before we even begin with the gesture of letting go, as a way of tending to the soil before we're planting the seeds for social regeneration or even personal regeneration. We had spoken before about how in the telling of a myth, there can be a sense of this letting go, as well as a sense of almost a cathartic purification. Can you speak to that some more? Even not just the telling of the myth, but also the hearing of the myth, like, Odysseus, when he hears his story told and begins to weep, hides his face and weeps because he's hearing his own story. But anyway, I just wanted to dive into this idea of the purification that happens in the process of the telling. It's not necessarily an intellectual experience, but more of this deeper cathartic where the story takes us to a deeper source of knowing.
It makes me think of this elder from the Aleutian Isles in Alaska that I have spent some time with, named Ilarion Mikrulieff, and he was teaching the Way of Counsel in a program I was in, and he spoke kind of about how telling a story or speaking in a council is like listening out loud. And that when you're speaking from that kind of place of emergence and that kind of place of spontaneity and from the heart, that your voice becomes listening. You're listening through by speaking, and for me, I think that's central to the integration, because I don't know about purification. I'm interested in it, but I don't know about it. But it's the experience of like, oh, now you're in the room with me because you came out. Sometimes I tell stories, and I get picked by a story, and I start to tell it, and I'm like, oh boy, I have to say that thing out loud. I have to talk about the murder of children out loud without judgment, without judging the character, because then I've gone into the commentator seat instead of the teller seat. And both are powerful, but when I'm telling, I'm trying to tell, not comment. And so suddenly it's like, wow, this is something. So what do I do with that? I can shame it, and then everyone in the room knows I'm shaming it, which is maybe possible. Or I can say, oh, there's something in me that is that thing, and now it's in the room, and then it has weight, and then to me it has like an alchemical function, because we're acknowledging that we've got worlds within worlds within worlds inside of us, and we're not pure. There's no like pure good and evil. There's no like you're a terrible being and I'm a good being. There's all of these messy things smashing up against each other, and I think that's where the polish comes from, if not the purification. The polish of my heart, and my being in the world comes through being a gateway for things that I would rather exile. And I think that in hearing a story, the first question I always ask is like, when I have that tension of like, oh, I hate that. Stop. We shouldn't tell that story. I don't want to hear about Odin anymore because he, or Zeus, or whoever it is who does terrible things all of the time. Like, let's cancel them. It's like, oh no, what in me resonates with what this being is doing, and what can I learn about myself by acknowledging and accepting that I've been there and I've done that, maybe not in the same way, but and that there's power there, particularly as a person with carrying the types of privileges that I'm carrying in a male body, in an upper middle class body, in a white body. Like, there's so much medicine and power in like taking on and eating and metabolizing those aspects of myself instead of pushing them out, putting them on someone else, marginalizing them, in some way.
I love this. Let's take it a step further. Now, when someone is hearing a myth, sometimes it opens that crack inside of themselves to see the mythic proportions of themselves in maybe what had otherwise always they had viewed as something very mundane. I think you said it as sometimes the myth reflects better than the individual telling. It is the alchemy of the individual experience. Dive into that a little more for us.
I guess I would just tell a story about my own life because it's so personal, having that kind of experience. The sense is that I've experienced, and I've experienced with young people, I've also experienced with myself, is that sometimes a myth tells more truth about my personal experience than I can through just telling you about what happened. Signed up to go study with Martin Shaw at his summer school, the school, West County School of Myth, and he opens his mouth and starts telling this story, which is called the Meister Stormworm. It's a story from the Orkney Isles in the north of Scotland, between Scotland and Norway. And he's telling this story, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, just kind of like in it, and I'm like, he's telling my life right now. Like, he's literally, this story is my life. Every moment of my life leading up to that moment of deciding to not be here anymore when I was 22, it's just like bop, 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 bop. And I'm sitting there like, what does that mean? That some group of people dreamed this story out of the earth in Scotland thousands of years ago. And here I am, and I've lived it, and that's kind of the dragon I've been chasing since then. And it's one of the main stories that I tell, because every time I tell it, I'm telling something true about myself to people that I can't say just by telling them plot by plot points of my life. And that's the main story I tell young people. And I always tell them that, like, I'm telling you about something so true about myself that if I said it with my own words, it would break. It wouldn't mean anything to you. So here's this. And what does that mean for us now that you know me this way? So that's, that's what I would say a bit in response to that. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for bearing the rawness of that, and the bearing witness to the deeper truth of who we are. In that, along that thought, I want to look at the invitation and the invocation that happens when we are storytelling. As we were talking about the letting go, and then this aspect of letting come. When we want to either tell a myth or even just tell about our own moments of significance, there's an internal development that we need to go through in order to invite the story to be present in the space with us. And part of that is opening the crack to the mythopoetic world and allowing that there is another dimension of reality that can be present. But another aspect is doing some inner work to, as Martin talks about, courting the stories, and not just being in this privileged mindset that a myth is going to just show up because I can read it off the page, but to really do the inner work so that when we are sharing a story, that the depth of meaning shows up, like what you were just sharing, that there's this deeper truth begins to resonate through the story. If you could speak more to that, this is, I think, the key aspect that we really want to bring into our work in Regen Collective, is building this space of resonance.
Yeah, the storyteller who comes to mind is there's this storyteller, her name's Joanne Blake, and she is from, or she goes by Jo Blake, Dr. Jo Blake, and she's from England. She's in England as well. And she did her PhD thesis on what she calls emergent storytelling. And she's incredible. I can link, she sent me her thing, and I'm sure she'd be happy for me to share it with you. And she speaks about this experience of coming up as a storyteller, and how there's, you know, what she terms the school of like revival storytelling, right? Which is, like you said, which is like, it's on the page, I'm gonna study it, then I'm gonna get on the stage and I'm gonna tell it the same way, in service to keeping it alive, right? That's actually really beautiful. That's like tending a seed and letting it plant, right? But then it's also in some way like expecting the same corn is going to sprout from that seed that then the corn plant that you took it from, right? It's like, I'm going to get the same exact corn, this genetically identical corn every time. And I don't know how conscious that is for people, you know, and she talks about her experience of not fitting into that kind of world of storytelling, because what was happening to her was something emergent and new and never before seen was erupting out of her every time she went to go open her mouth. And she wanted to move her bodies in the way that none of her mentors moved their bodies, and she wanted to sing and dance and do these things that didn't make sense in that context, because they were, in my understanding of what she has said and written, like genuine emergent movements from her resonance with that story. And I find that so in Martin Shaw's work as well, there's this sense, and in my experience of storytelling, that there's what Martin calls the bones of a story. There's this very dry, like if you read the Brothers Grimm, right? Almost any version you read, very dry, plot by plot. A few things are expressed in incredible detail, and then everything else is like, they walked into the woods, you know, there was a house, and that, so you've got this bone structure, you've got this framework, and that part of being a teller in an emergent way is for me, right, as someone who's really informed by magic, by magical practice, is like you're summoning a daemon or an angel, right, which both just mean messenger. You're summoning something into the room that's ready to speak. And in order to do that, it's got to have flesh. And for me, and I think for Martin, the flesh only makes sense to what, in the context of what's in that room in that moment, right? It's in that corn metaphor. It's planting corn and knowing you're going to get a piece of corn. You're going to get a corn plant that is informed by the soil it was planted in, the wind patterns, the heat, the songs people sang to it, you know, the other corn plants around it, who else is in the soil, what bird decided to like eat and poop, and, you know, all of these things are informing what that story feast looks like each time you tell it. And for me, cultivating that kind of space internally and externally in a room with people, that we make an agreement in some way. Like, this is not going to be what you read. Right now, I'm working on the Arthurian myths. It's like, this is not going to be what you read in Mallory. This is not going to be what you read in Chrétien de Troyes. It's not going to be the King Arthur movie that you watched as a kid. But I assure you that I've done my research and I'm telling you the story. And it's going to take a different shape tonight than it ever has and it ever will again. And that, for me, that kind of space in the room and in myself that's where the story, that's the courtship. I made space for it to be itself, just the same way that I would for someone that I'm courting to be in relationship with me. I'm making space in myself and my world for that person to be themselves. Whether or not it rubs against me or makes me uncomfortable or whatever, and it really comes down to believing, but then also practicing, because belief is only half the equation, that the story is alive and it's a being, of some kind. However you want to story the story as a being, it's alive and it's there to do work. And sometimes that work is completely different than the work that you want to do with the story. And sometimes that is okay, and sometimes that's hard as a teller or as someone listening to a story, right? Like, you want the story to free you or tell you something new or whatever, and you just keep getting walloped over the head with the same old thing you have always known about yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. I love that. The practice of inviting the story to show up as itself, just as we would with a dear friend or a trusted colleague, knowing that they can show up and do their good work. So I want to segue this into the design work that our team is doing. And we're looking at creating this, storytelling space with the understanding that all of us in these modern times have had threshold experiences that are not fully integrated. What are some of the aspects that we could be bringing into this space so that we are inviting, not necessarily, like you were saying, not necessarily that peak high experience that we could crash from, but more inviting the beginnings of an inner shift, the beginnings of an integrative experience. We want to make sure that this experience is not a therapy session. It's not about digging up trauma. It's not about me dumping some kind of challenging experience into the space and in order to try to let it go. More, we're trying to look at unearthing these experiences that have a huge amount of potential energy, that when we then have the opportunity to share it, even in the most simple, bland way, we're still beginning the process of an inner integration that then opens that crack a little wider to the multidimensional realities that we can all be living and experiencing if we were more fully integrated. So we'd love to hear from you. What are some really practical aspects of holding this space in a good way? Also, talk to us about some of the practices that you do to invite the mythopoetic into a circle like we might be creating. Thanks.
what's coming to me, right, is there's J.R.R. Tolkien in one of his letters. I can't remember. Oh no, actually, it's in On Fairy Stories, which is a lecture that he wrote, that's been published as an essay. And he writes essentially that for him, his experience of writing The Lord of the Rings, which was that he was crossing a threshold into Middle Earth, into like a real place, and then coming back and reporting his experience. That it wasn't a creation; it was a report. And so, in he essentially was reporting the Red Book of the West March, right? So that's Bilbo's journal, and he was like, "I found this, and here it is." um, but he also writes that often when we go off into the imaginal, um, when we come back to this side, all of that fairy gold that we collected is just withered and dead brown leaves in our hands, which sounds like what it feels like what you're saying. What you're saying when we have a significant moment across a threshold of some kind, and then we come back, and either there's no one to tell that story to, or the person who we tell that story to just sees the leaves and doesn't see the gold. Um, and I've had so many of those experiences in my life, um, of having profound experiences of either beauty or terror and telling them to people and just being like, everyone experiences that. Oh, you're making it up. Whatever the um, response was, or silence, or I don't have time to hear your story, or that didn't happen. I do a lot of work doing nature connection mentoring, and one of the things that I experience all the time is that kids have profound experiences. Like this one kid, like 3, 4, 5 days in a row, would get dive bombed by hummingbirds that would like get 3 or 4 inches from his face, and I'd be with him and I'd see it happen. But then his parents didn't believe that it was going on. Like, it was very much so he'd come home and tell these stories of these encounters with these hummingbirds. And there was no one outside of our little nest of forest school that was giving it the significance that it felt like to him. And I actually think that that's like one of the most painful griefs that we experience, of like things being significant to us and it having nowhere to land. And so the thing that comes up in my work with rites of passage and what's coming up now is this sense of that I've heard from Michael Meade and others, that like the job of the mentor is to find one thing in the mentee or the person that they can bless. And if you can find one thing that you can bless with your whole entire heart in someone, that's enough, right? And that's been kind of the hard experience for me as a person who does rites of passage mentoring, as I came in with like, every single one of these kids is going to know bird language. Every single one of these kids is going to know how to track animals. Every single one of these kids is going to make fire without matches. They're all going to report their depression being held, and no one's going to, all of these things are going to have transformed relationships with each other and their parents. And I've never met any of those goals. I've never done it in my 8 years of working with adolescents. It's not once, but what I have experienced is finding something that I can truly love and bless in every single kid, and then telling it to them. And even when I think they don't hear me, just telling it to them. And those have been the things. Now, some of the guys I started working with when they were 11 are now 18, going to just finished their first year of college. And when I hang out with them, those are the things I hear about. Oh, you really saw that butterfly experience I had mattered, and no one else did. Things like that. Had this one guy who had a butterfly land on his toe while he was on a 24-hour fast. And it was like, no one else thought it was amazing, but I thought it was the coolest thing ever. And so I told him, and it mattered. And so that sense of, Lauren, we had talked about this sense of like, what is it to listen to someone tell a story that you think is the flattest, like you would never read it if it was a book. If it was a movie, you would walk out, but then just turning on your ears so that you can find the one thing in there that's gold that you can mirror back. Because that's how I think, in a culture where we're not really taught how to tell good stories about ourselves. In fact, we're taught that if we're telling stories about ourselves, we're probably taking up too much space and we should probably shut up, unless we're a certain type of person, that it's actually, as facilitators, it's our job to listen the story out of someone, even when it's flat. For each person that goes, you designate, okay, beforehand, maybe you have 10 people and you have, 6 of you. And for each of the 10 people, one of you is going to listen for the mythopoetic thing, the like beautiful, golden, powerful thing that person's saying, even though they didn't say it. And one of you is going to listen to like the fact of the matter, and that you're going to each reflect back something from that kind of lens, and so that they're getting both like heard, right? Because some people really need this sense of like, you repeated back exactly what I said and now I feel heard. And other people, and there's another part of us that needs that, like, here's this dose of meaning that I heard in your story that you didn't say, and I'm going to give it to you now because this is the gold that we're exchanging. So that listening on different levels. And I've been really inspired. I have a friend, Kate Morales, and they're from Georgia, and they have come to a few of my storytellings, and they have always offered this sense of like, okay, this person in the audience is going to listen with their body. They're not even going to listen to your words and the story. And then when they reflect back at the end, they're going to reflect back their body. And this person is going to listen to the tonality of your voice, but not the words. And we're going to hear that. So there's different ways of listening that make something mean something that it wouldn't have if we don't engage it. So those are some practices that I've been toying with and playing with in my work with youth, and also in my story work. And I think also, just like you said, it's like the clear agreement. In medieval alchemy, the vas bene clausum, the well-sealed vessel. We all know how much time we're going to have. We all know how many people are going to reflect to us. We all know that we're going to take a bio break. It helps me drop in when my facilitators have been clear with me, the agreements and the temporality and the intention, because then I can drop into timelessness, and because I know someone's holding me.
That's beautiful, and thank you for those practical aspects as well. And what would you say about how to set the space and hold the space so that we're not drifting into American therapy mode, which is, I think, more well taught in our culture than storytelling. So being trauma informed is more widely practiced now, to the point that people are almost getting stuck in these trauma loops, and we're almost inviting each other to stay in trauma loops rather than moving beyond them. So what's something that we could be doing in our space is, as we're setting our agreements beforehand, to just be upfront and clear that this is not a trauma therapy circle, and to encourage participants to get the self-care and personal support that they need in outside the circle. But when we are in the practice of the circle, and what are those like little red flags we want to watch out for to help people be aware that if you're hearing something that's triggering you, how do we support the space so that everyone can stay in a holistic awareness and moving through rather than wallowing?
Yeah. Wow. Good question. Solid. Hard work, I think. What's coming to me right now? I've been rereading Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy for a class on movement building that I'm taking.
My brother just sent that to me.
Yeah,
It's so funny.
Yeah, really deep movement work. And something that's just popping into my head from their work is this having more time, wanting to do less and having more time. So that when inevitably these things get dug up, or these movement energies start ping-ponging around the room and different people are in trauma, that you can actually institute a pause and say, wow, like as a facilitator, be like, wow, we really need to take a pause, and we're gonna like do a somatic practice together of shaking this out of our body, or we're gonna ask you, go lay down outside for 3 minutes, or whatever it is that works for you to move the energy, because you're, like you said, it's inevitable that something that someone else is saying is gonna dig up skeletons in me. And sometimes I can just be with it and I can be like, wow, that's there. And other times it's like, okay, now I'm engulfed. So the capacity to institute the pause and then to do something. Because I agree with you, there's this, sometimes we're so tracking trauma, and we're so good at trying to be in that process, or we're trying to be good at it, and we're less good at the processing of trauma to get back into a spiral of resilience. So what is it to like plan your agenda so there's time for that, because we know it's going to happen because we're humans that weren't taught how to do it a lot of the time. So that's the first thing that comes up in my head. Is like, okay, so what would it be like to ask for 2 hours when you know you only need an hour and a half? So you have 30 minutes to play with when you need a 5-minute break, or you need a 10-minute break, or you need to stop someone. In person, it's when I was learning the way of counsel as put forward by the Ojai Foundation, if someone was in the middle of sharing and they got to the agreed time limit, just dinging a bell. Like, here we go. It feels rude. I'm interrupting you, but I'm dinging the bell. Doesn't mean shut up. It means here you are at your limit. And we all made an agreement together. And then a minute goes by and you ding the bell again. Okay, you're past your limit. And what does that mean? So we're tracking that as those people like me who tend to go over their limit need those reminders, even if it doesn't feel very good sometimes. And I think it really is like you all coming in, first of all, to like stack the deck, like one of you goes first and maybe second, and then a couple other people go, and then 2 more people go, whatever, or someone that is going to be able to share in the way that you want. In the work that I've done with 8 Shields with John Young, that when we're putting together an event, you want those people who have done it before there, and you want to go to them and be like, so you've been here before, can you sing this song with me at dinner time? Or, oh man, I heard you tell a story at the fire the other night. Would you be willing to be our afternoon program? That stacking the deck. So it's like, because it creates emergence, even though you're like facilitating so much, it creates the possibility for emergence because you're role modeling what's possible. So those are some things that come up for me. And that maybe, one other thing is just when I've been facilitating rituals on Zoom recently, and me and my co-facilitator, we always meet beforehand for a half hour and do whatever it is we need to do to be ready, whether that's doing an invocation or our own ritual, or just meditating together, or whatever what we're doing calls for. that sense of you create a field and then you invite someone into it. Something that I've been thinking about is this: what does it mean to repopulate our imaginations? Do we, like, like a gut microbiome, that is simplified and simplified and simplified through eating. We consume a certain type of story so often, whether that's a story of isolation or loneliness or individualism or progress. These what yeah these sorts of myths that we consume, these types of meaning that we swim within. What is it to repopulate our imaginations with other stories and other ways of seeing and being before we start trying to tell stories about ourselves? And so for me, like when we were talking, Lauren, that was where my kind of offering was coming from, of like, maybe people need to be like courted into the imaginal. And by hearing, you know, Tatterhood or a Baba Yaga story, or some epic John O'Donohue poems, or something by Naomi Shihab Nye, or like something that we is tried and true and tells the truth for us as facilitators, that we then invite some beautiful turn of phrase that they wouldn't have said, or some way of seeing what they're telling that they wouldn't have saw unless they put on the glasses of that story first. And that we feed, it's like this, I think it's either Rumi or Hafez, and I'll just do that thing that people tend to do, misquoting Rumi and Hafez, because why not be in the tradition? But it's like, if you haven't been fed, become bread, right? So we haven't been fed. And they haven't been fed. So someone's got to feed them. So what is it to feed them first and then be fed? Yeah.
I think that's the gesture right there. I think you've captured it perfectly.
This inventory taking, I want to know more about it and talk it through, like, as thinking partners. I totally agree that it needs to, that we all have to be grounded, and our role as facilitators starts with building that field way before we open the room. So I'm not sure we covered that so much, and I'd like to go back there.
Thanks, Lisa. I think it's great. Yeah, Chaise, what do you have to say on that?
Thank you. Yeah. I'll just really just sit with the fact that it's so emergent for me, right, as my practice in the world. I mean, yeah, it's emergent and it's new and it's old, right? I think so much of it has for me been my practice with taking inventory. Is both, it's both a internal awareness practice, from my time studying meditation, particularly in the Thai forest Buddhist tradition. My life before storytelling, my dream before storytelling, to be a Dharma teacher, so it's that practice of taking inventory of what is present, and the ways in which, like, sometimes that, like, solar awareness of, like, only now, like, let's evaporate anything that's not from now, overtakes. And I think that there's a way in which myth telling and mythopoetics has made me realize how deeply entangled now is with the past and the future. And I think that's where this idea of, like, the ghost comes from, right? Like, these memories, these past experiences. We see this in trauma psychology too, like that when if you got broken up with in a very terrible way at a table with a checkered tablecloth, and it didn't get healed, every time you sit at a checkered tablecloth, some piece of that is going to move through your system. Maybe it's not the whole thing, but that memory comes alive and it's a living thing. So I think that there's that internal practice of taking inventory. What's here? What's triggered by sitting in this room with these people? This person talks like my dad. Okay, now he's here or whatever. So taking that kind of inventory through, somatic practice and also mindfulness. But then there's also the type of taking inventory that involves awareness of place, where we are, the time of day, the season, the birds, the cars, the sign, all of that kind of inventory.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then there's also the type of inventory that involves understanding the like historical locality that we're in. The nested inventories, right, of taking stock of our family histories, our socialized racial histories, our national histories, and our deep time histories, right? The geology and the movements of systems. Like, I'm so moved by Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, this work with deep time and situating ourselves there.
And she also works with grieving. Yeah.
And that honoring our pain as an inventory that allows us to see with new eyes when we've done it. And it's hard work, right? Like that's a 10-year immersion before you even show up for your one session. And finding ways for us each to be in our own places, of like being able to hold those different of taking stock of who we really are outside of the confines of just this one individual body. I would never tell someone what a story means, right? When I tell a story, that's just not my practice. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm not going to tell you what it means because I want it to wash you, right? I want it to hit all of your exposed geography and geology and your whole system and see what happens. What is going to happen to the mountain that you are when this wind blows by it, right? Instead of being like, here's this supplement that I know exactly what it's going to do to you, and here I want you to be like me, so I'm going to tell you this story. And that we don't ask anyone to do anything when they hear a story, but what we do ask is for them to be in reciprocity with the story, right? Because it's a practice of animism in some way, right? It's like acknowledging that something can matter. For me, that's what the practice of like feeding a story after I tell it, or reflecting back what I'm hearing you say, Lisa, like, is a practice of honoring that you hit me, like what you said matters to me. What the story did in the room matters. I don't know why it matters or what it means, but it matters. And so I'm going to tell you. Well, I just love this conversation between the real and the mythic, right? There's a tension. Yeah. It's like yeah, they're not for me.
They're not either or.
Yeah. Right. and that the tension between them that we feel in our lives growing up in the Western world, where we're told that certain things are real and certain things are fake, is something that we live with. It may not be the truth, but it is something I think we live with culturally. And so what would it be like to play that tension in a way that it actually makes something beautiful? And that's been so much of my orientation to telling stories. I'm not telling a story to enchant you or to make you believe something that's not true or to wow you or entertain you like a Hollywood movie. I'm telling you a story that is true but never happened, right? That all myths are true, even if they never happened. And so the imaginative and associative leaps that we're making as an audience are what make it real or true or resonant when you're talking about Merlin teaching Arthur through transforming him into animals, right? Like that's very fantastical and strange. And in my work as a forest school teacher with pre-K to first graders, that that's one version of way I could tell you of what I do with those kids. I take them out there on the land and I teach them that there are a fish and a bird and a fox and a deer, and that does something to us. And my lesson plan actually might just look like that story for that day as a teacher. Yeah. Thank you, Paulus. What you just said reminds me of kind of one of the central maxims of the Zapatista movement, which is an autonomous indigenous movement in Chiapas, of creating a world, or not creating, but being in a world where many worlds fit.
Exactly.
Right. And the Western story is there is one world and there is one truth. And
there is one reality, and you
yeah.
can only look at that in a certain way. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, so much of the Zapatista practice is, as far as I understand it through my study of it as a social movement, is about using story to reveal the invisibilized violence of the world and the invisibilized systems of the world, right? So one of the central images of the world is that of their movement is that they call capitalism the many-headed hydra, right? And it's eating us from many different directions in different ways all of the time, including land and women and our imaginations and our subsistence economies are all getting eaten by the same beast in different ways at different times. And what does that do to our hearts and our minds as activists when this disembodied system like capitalism suddenly has a name and a body, right? It has a body that then we can engage with. And so, the thing just in this ending here, the thing I would leave with is that like storytelling, in emergent strategy, she talks about like all activism is an act of science fiction. It's all storytelling because we're creating a world, we're aiming at a world that isn't here. We're thinking in ways that we, as people who have been socialized into the violence of the Western system, don't yet know how to think, right? So it's an act of creation. And for me, asking someone to stretch, to hear the real in the imaginal is like, that's my seat, right? That not everybody's doing that and not everybody has to do that, but that's my work, is like, I'm going to tell you this old story that I uncovered in a manuscript from 400 AD. And we're going to see what that does to our classroom or our community or our place. And what you're really revealing for me, Kristen, is there's also that place that I do in my work also of telling the story of how that historically was created in a mythic way. Like, why do we have this manuscript? What's the story? And or how, or the story of MLK or the story of, the Zapatista uprising is told in a mythic way, but it's something that is happening now. So there's many tongues, right? We think we have one tongue, but there's many tongues in our mouths. And how do we practice using the right tongue at the right time? Just so excited to connect with you all. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's been a blessing for me too.
Yes. Thank you, Chaise, to your dedication to this work and bringing it forth in new and unusual ways to share with us and many people.